about an hour or so, maybe an hour and 10, and then we'll be able to save plenty of time for questions. It is very disorienting not to see your faces, but I will assume that you are all smiling and laughing along with me because I would like to keep this as informal and comfortable as possible. So at the end, I think if you just submit your questions through the chat function, we'll probably be able to do it that way. All right, slide, please. Thank you. My on top of everything, my share screen doesn't work with my Zoom, so I have to ask Peter for help with this. We'd like to acknowledge BCPA, British Columbia Psychology Association, for organizing Psychology Month. In February, there was going to be a number of virtual talks throughout the month, so please visit the BCPA website for more information. You can also reach a psychologist through BCPA by contacting them either through the website or by phone number. So again, thank you very much, BCPA, for organizing this and for inviting me to do this. All right, next slide, please. Since we will be talking about pretty difficult material, I can't see your faces, I can't see your reactions. I will trust that everybody feels comfortable being able to take care of themselves. If you start feeling uncomfortable, if you need a break, that's totally fine. You can leave, you can come back, do what you need to take care of yourselves through this. All right. So just a little bit about me and my background to get started. My name is Dr. Anna Khaylis. I am a registered psychologist here in Vancouver. I've been registered here in Canada for about 10 years. I currently have a private practice where I see a really wide range of clients, kind of ages, presenting problems, histories. But one thing most of my clients seem to have in common is a history of painful childhood experiences, that each of them carries in their own way. So even if it's not the focus of our work, it always seems to provide kind of a bit of a backdrop for me when I try to understand, the current problems. I have been working with trauma for the better part of 20 years. When people ask me how I have done that, why I want to do that, nothing I think encompasses my experience working with trauma better than this quote by Dr. Bruce Perry, one of the pioneers of our field, a child psychiatrist, a real pioneer in the field of trauma and development, kind of trauma and brain development. And so he writes in his book, The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog, surprisingly, it is often when wandering through the emotional carnage left by the worst of mankind that we often find the best of humanity as well. And I really find this to reflect, I think, my experience of working with survivors of trauma for the last couple of decades. I started out as a study abroad kid in Europe, volunteering with organizations that helped survivors of human trafficking. Got most of my training in the States when I started getting my education for psychology. Most of my training with American soldiers and veterans. Moved to Canada about 10 and a half years ago, worked for about 4 years in Canada with Canadian soldiers, veterans, and RCMP members. And like I said, just continue to find my way working with people who have survived something quite painful in their life. Even though, of course, it's difficult to listen to these stories, I find it incredibly inspiring. And in some of these some of these painful kind of dark stories that I have the privilege of hearing, I also find a lot of hope, a lot of inspiration, a lot of motivation, and really feel like my clients teach me about life just as much as I can hopefully help them and teach them. All right, next slide. So what is trauma? I think that's a fair question. I think we tend to use a lot of words kind of interchangeably, right? Pain and trauma and stress. And there's a real difference in that. And the definition of trauma, kind of inherent to what actually defines a traumatic experience, is exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence. And this can include directly experiencing the event, this can include witnessing it, or this can include learning that it's occurred to somebody close to you, right? So adults can experience this in a number of different ways. Combat, assault, a car accident, that is just to name a few. When we talk about trauma in childhood, we also need to consider certain experiences that would threaten a child's sense of safety, sense of routine, and healthy development, right? So this can include the obvious ones like childhood abuse and neglect. Those are the two big ones when we think about childhood trauma. But it can also include, for example, witnessing domestic violence. It can include growing up in a household where one parent has significant mental health challenges or substance abuse issues. And it can also include experiencing significant instability due to parental conflict, separation, or community violence. So these are just a few examples of how kind of certain experiences would threaten a child's integral sense of safety and sense of security. We also know now that there are a few other kind of considerations to include when we think about trauma. One of these is intergenerational trauma, right? We know now that we can pass on our legacies of pain and trauma to future generations. We can pass this on a genetic level, and we can pass these on through our relationships, through our histories, right? Through the way we parent. And so we always kind of want to include that sense as well as children who grow up in chronic poverty or who experience chronic systemic racism, right? These experiences would be considered as kind of adverse childhood experiences as well. So why does this matter? Why, as grown-ups, why are we talking about things that happened years ago, decades ago, depending on how old we are? And a lot of my clients initially tell me when I start asking about early childhood, when I start asking about upbringing, they'll often tell me, what's the point? Why are we talking about this? What does it matter years later? Or they'll kind of laugh at me. It's like the old cliche that everything is mom and dad's fault. And so fair enough, right? A major focus of my clinical work is always how to make meaningful changes in your life. So why do we need to talk about stuff that happened 20, 30 years ago? Why do we need to dwell on the past? And the answer to this kind of largely lies in brain development and how early experiences can shape the blueprint of our brain and can shape kind of how we make sense of the world, other people, and ourselves. So let's go on to the next slide. The brain is one of the most complex, mysterious entities in the entire universe, I think. I wanted to show you this model. This is a mini version of how a brain looks. I have a few versions that I'll be using because I get really excited when I talk about the brain. This one, my 10-year-old son built for me, and so he made me promise to show it to all of you and to tell him that he's the one that built it for us. So this organ, this entity, is responsible for every thought that we have, every feeling that we have, any change that happens in our body, any decision that we make, all coming from our friend, the brain. when we are born, so the brain consists of brain cells called neurons. When we are born with 100 billion neurons in our brains. That is about 10 times the number of stars in the entire Milky Way and about 20 times the number of people on the planet. When we are born, we have the most neurons that we will ever have in our entire life. But when we are born, these neurons are largely disconnected. They're kind of free floating. There's a lot of them, but they don't quite know how to talk to each other yet. As we develop, as we grow, these neurons start communicating with each other through synapses. And certain neurons who fire together, wire together. They become friends. Other neurons join their friend group, and these neurons make up certain networks in our brain. These networks are what are responsible for our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. Now, the way the brain develops depends on both our genetics and our experiences. So the brain develops in a use-dependent fashion. What that means is that networks that are used over and over and over again will become very strong and will fuse together strongly. And all of this growth, most of this growth happens in about the first decade of life. After that, the neurons that we don't use and the networks that we don't use will prune them out. So what we're left with as we get older is fewer networks, fewer neurons, but tighter networks, stronger networks that are more ingrained and kind of hang together strongly. And this is obviously important, right? Because if we have certain repetitive experiences, those will strengthen the networks in our brain that are used to those experiences and will kind of affect how we deal with them and how we expect certain things to go. All right, let's go on to the next slide. I want to spend some time talking about the different parts of the brain, because that is really the only way that we can truly understand how the brain works together and how trauma impacts all these different parts of the brain. Excuse me. So let's start with the brainstem. The brain develops bottom up, which means it develops this part of the brain first, kind of right here in the back. So if this is kind of, I have a third brain now, the fist. If this is kind of your brain, it's this part that develops first. It's called the brainstem. It develops in utero, and this is the most primitive part of our brain. In fact, it's so primitive, we have it in common with lizards, with other reptiles. So often you'll hear to it referred to as the reptilian brain. The reptilian brain is pretty much responsible for anything a newborn can do. Sleeping, waking, sleep cycles, appetite, kind of feeling hungry or feeling full, digestion, so your body releasing waste, feeling temperature or wetness, and starting to sense touch, right? Starting to learn touch and starting to learn that touch can be pleasurable. So then the next part of the brain to develop is this little guy here called the cerebellum. The cerebellum is largely responsible for our rhythm, balance, and movement. So whenever you're taking a walk, whenever you're playing sports, hitting a tennis ball, kicking a soccer ball, it is this little guy that is firing off. After we are born, the development of our limbic system really takes off. So our limbic system is right in the middle of our brain. So if I make a cut like this, and flip it open and look inside, right into the middle, I hit my limbic system. The limbic system we have in common with other mammals, so that is also why it is called the mammalian brain. You will hear this as well. And its job is to constantly monitor external and internal signals to keep our body safe and to keep our body in homeostasis. And all homeostasis means is just steadiness, right? So its job is to kind of regulate our steadiness, but also alert us to any change in the environment. Our limbic system is responsible for the 4 F's: fighting, fleeing, feeding, and the F word that I cannot say on a professional meeting on Zoom, so I will say fornication. So see, this is where it would really come in handy to see your faces, to see if any of you are laughing at my brain jokes. But all of those 4 functions are housed in the limbic system. So it is also home of the amygdala. The amygdala is a little structure kind of nestled right in here, which works kind of like a smoke alarm in your brain. Its job is to detect threat, and not only threat, but also opportunity. So like a smoke alarm, if it detects danger, or on the other hand, if it detects a partner, a potential romantic partner, it will alert your body by releasing a squirt of hormones in the brain and the body. If it's a threat, if it's a real threat, then the amygdala will alert your body by releasing a tremendous cascade of stress hormones. This is a pre-programmed survival plan called the fight or flight response, which we will visit in the next couple of slides. But the purpose of the amygdala is to register certain uh-ohs and kind of alert you to them so that you can react kind of quite quickly and automatically and be able to keep yourself safe. Really, that's really what emotions are. I think in our current culture, current society, emotions and feelings get a bit of a bad reputation, right? It's, touchy-feely stuff, and why do we talk about feelings? But really, all feelings is just a quick reaction to something in the environment, to a change in the environment. And they help us survive. Every emotion we have, right? Fear, anger, sadness, guilt, these are all driven by very specific kind of threats in the environment that we then have an action tendency to want to respond to. Again, to keep ourselves safe. A good example of this, you know what, let's hold on with the examples. Let's move on and talk about the brainstem and the limbic system. Wait, hold on, go back. I'm not done with the brain yet, thank you. The brainstem and the limbic system together make up the emotion brain. And basically the function of the emotion brain is to help you survive. And its primary concern is survival, right? To look out for danger or look out on the other extreme for opportunity. All right, now we can talk about the frontal lobes, kind of right here. So right here in your forehead. Largely what makes us unique in the animal kingdom. Largely what are responsible for language, planning, consequences, impulse control, reasoning. It is the ability, right? It's the ability on one hand to feel very angry and want to punch someone out, but then on the other hand, we don't, because we know the consequences would be too great. That's your frontal lobe, right? Every time you kind of make a conscious decision, every time you choose something based on rational thought or logic, it's your frontal lobes that are guiding you. It is the most advanced, part of the brain responsible for our most advanced thinking activities. It is also the part of the brain to develop last. So this part of the brain is not fully developed until our 20s, if you can imagine. So I'm very sorry if there are parents of teenagers out there. It's going to be a while before your teenagers have fully developed frontal lobes. So if anybody out there is a parent to a toddler or a early school age child, not even close, right? So if you have ever tried to reason with a toddler or a small child, you'll probably notice that it has not generally worked very well. Teenagers are not particularly known for their amazing ability to make great decisions or to regulate their impulses. Also, this is part of the reason why, right? That part of the brain responsible is just not fully on board yet. So even though we talk about all of these parts separately, they actually don't quite work separately. They work together. Dr. Perry calls it like an orchestra. They work together like different parts of a symphony or different parts of an orchestra, right? Creating a symphony, creating music. Each part playing its role, but together creating kind of beautiful music that's responsible for everything that we do. A couple of interesting pieces. So the limbic system, which like I said, is the home of your emotion. It is the home of your automatic kinds of emotional reactions. The limbic system receives input from the environment. Listen to this, more than twice as fast as the frontal lobes. We register threat viscerally before we can think about it, right? We are literally feeling before we are thinking. Anyone who has driven has had that experience, right? Where you're driving and everything's fine, everything's going well. All of a sudden, just your heart's pounding. You've slammed on the brakes, right? Before you've even realized it. And then you realize a dog has crossed the street. And your body has reacted automatically before the thinking brain has even really had a chance to register what's going on. Then your thinking brain sees that the dog has passed, the threat is over, and it relaxes, right? It assesses the situation, says it's all good, you can calm down. When we are emotionally activated, when our emotional brain is agitated, it quite literally hijacks the thinking brain. It will direct blood flow from the thinking brain to the emotion brain and to the rest of your body. But the more emotional we are, right, the more scared we are, the more the frontal lobes shut down, so that our actions, our movements become almost instinctual, right? We're not thinking about them. We are designed this way. Again, it helps keep us safe, right? If there's a threat, if there's an animal running at us, right? A tiger running at us, we have to be able to register that as a threat and book it before we really have time to kind of sit there and think about it. So again, this is why we are wired this way, right? It helps us survive. A good analogy that I like between the thinking brain and the emotion brain is that of a smoke detector, right? I call the amygdala your smoke alarm. That's kind of what it is. It's, sometimes our amygdala goes off when there isn't real fire, right? Sometimes a smoke alarm in our home, it'll start signaling to us when there's a real fire. Sometimes it goes off because the toast is burned. And then it's up to my frontal lobes to assess the situation and figure out, why is it going off? Once I assess that this, it's burned toast, I can kind of go back to normal. If there's a fire, I will act accordingly. But what if my perception of stress and threat, what if that perception is altered, right? What if that perception is impacted? Then I might react in a frenzy, right? Every time I hear the smoke alarm, I will be certain that there's a fire and I will react accordingly, right? And so just using this analogy, we can kind of see how that might interfere with my life, right? When I'm a grown-up, personally and professionally. So sometimes, this is an interesting little tidbit, sometimes when we are very emotionally activated, which means that the emotion brain has hijacked the thinking brain and shut down the thinking brain. We are not thinking very clearly. We are not thinking very rationally. What helps get the thinking brain back online is simply using words to label your feelings, right? So by simply saying to yourself, I'm feeling scared, or I'm feeling sad, or I'm feeling angry, it's kind of enough to activate the thinking brain, which is responsible for language, and then to help kind of regulate the emotion brain. That's really the job of the thinking brain, is to be able to assess the situation. And if it assesses that we're safe, it helps turn off that smoke alarm. All right, now we can go to the next slide. Thank you. So the brain develops, like I said earlier, in a use-dependent fashion, which means that parts that are used over and over and over again become stronger. Parts that are not used get weaker. Neurons that fire together wire together. Brain networks that are frequently used become your default response. So if as a child, my environment is one of love and safety, if I'm read to and talked to every day, then that will be the default setting of my brain. My emotion brain will know safety and rest, and my emotion brain will also know when I'm upset, I cry out, and my caregivers come and comfort me and soothe me. And so it'll also teach me to associate kind of comfort and touch with soothing and with pleasure. My thinking brain develops strongly, because it's activated by my caregivers talking and reading to me. And then my brain and my body will typically be at rest. And eventually, my thinking brain should be able to develop in such a way that it can regulate the emotion brain. However, if my environment is one of danger, if the emotion brain is constantly in activation, if the light switch is constantly turned on, the smoke alarm is constantly going off, that will become my default setting, right? If my emotion brain is the one that's being overused because it's constantly detecting threat, it will become stronger than the thinking brain. Those networks will become like my default setting. I will be constantly monitoring any signs of danger, and often neutral stimuli, a look from a teacher or an email from a colleague or a grumpy partner, this will be interpreted as dangerous. And my body will react accordingly. So this picture shows how our bodies react when we are stressed out. Really, there's a lot of words on this picture. Don't worry about the words so much. What this picture really shows is that stress is a full body response. It originates in the amygdala, but the cascade of tremendous hormones are sent throughout the entire body. Stress in and of itself is actually adaptive. It mobilizes energy, it mobilizes our bodies and the resources in our bodies to be able to solve urgent problems. And the body reacts to physical and psychological stressors similarly. However, when this system is taxed, right, when we are faced with this activation over and over and over again, then that can be a real problem. Particularly chronic psychological stress can take a real toll on our brain and body systems. So stress, or the recognition of threat, originates in the limbic system. If the amygdala recognizes an immediate threat, it releases a huge amount of energy into our body through hormones, which mobilize us for the flight or fight response. What are some characteristics of fight or flight? If we were in person right now, I would ask one of you to raise your hands. I can't do that, so I'm going to tell you. Most of you are probably familiar with this, right? If we go back to the example of driving the car, and a dog running across. Our heart races, our breathing quickens and gets more shallow in our chest. Our blood flows from the brain to our limbs. So we stop thinking clearly and we start moving. Our bodies release waste to make us lighter. And all of this is in preparation for either running away from the threat or fighting, hence the expression fight or flight. However, if we think back to our definition of trauma, most of the time, the fight or flight response is not available to us, right? I think this is one of the, and we can go on to the next slide, I think this is one of the inherent kind of characteristics of, and most devastating characteristics of trauma, is that we can't really do anything in those situations. Running away or fighting back is often not an option if we are held down, if we are trapped, or if we are little and cannot just go ahead and walk away, right? That means that we have huge amounts of stress hormones circulating throughout the body, huge amounts of energy circulating throughout the body with nowhere for them to go. Often, the most devastating impact of trauma will be the sense of feeling helpless and feeling powerless and feeling like there was nothing that you could do. And actually being able to move, being able to do something is actually a huge predictor of how one will move on from the trauma. But let's go back to this, right? So what happens when fight or flight is not an option? What happens when we have a huge amount of energy circulating through the body with nowhere for it to go? We activate the ultimate emergency response. It originates largely in the brainstem, right? This activation, this emergency response, it's called the freeze response. So it's the most primitive response we have, and it is like the 911 of danger. And what the freeze response does, what the brain does, is it basically floods itself with numbing hormones. It shuts down, it restricts blood, it slows your breathing rate, and it immobilizes you. Right? You might feel like your limbs are paralyzed. You might feel like you cannot move. You cannot do anything. You're frozen. A lot of clients describe it as just frozen, but at the same time, they cannot feel any more pain, right? So this is the brain preparing the body for injury. It numbs and freezes you in a way that in the moment is actually very adaptive. I don't know how many of you have heard of dissociation, right? This idea of kind of being able to leave, this idea of like watching something happen to you as if you're watching a movie. This is related highly to the freeze response, right? It's a skill. I call it a skill because it's a really protective skill that a lot of children develop. Again, when they are trapped in a trauma that they cannot do anything about, they cannot make it end, they leave mentally, right? I've had clients tell me that they've gone into a clock before, or they've gone into some imaginary safe world, while the trauma is happening. Again, how adaptive is that, right? It's incredible that we are able to have these ways to protect ourselves in those moments. When nothing else, no other power is available to us. Again, right, the kind of what happens is when these responses are used over and over and over and over again, right? Remember, neurons that fire together wire together, the networks become stronger. And these responses can really become like almost a default way of reacting to any perceived threat. All right, let's change slides. You know, we used to think the general kind of consensus was that children are resilient and bounce back easily. To some degree, this is true. To some degree, it's not true. I had a client recently tell me, she was yelled at all the time by her parents. She kind of vacillated between being neglected and left alone for long periods of time, and then being yelled at and berated. And she told me, I don't understand why I get so scared when people are mad at me now. She said, I was yelled at, she said, so much, I should be used to it, right? I should just be able to not care. And unfortunately, it doesn't quite work that way, right? And so we have to kind of take in some considerations when we're talking about the impact on children and how lasting it is or how pervasive it is. One of these is the age at which the trauma occurs. Again, this is important because of how the brain develops, right, from the bottom up, and how it develops as we get older. So if the trauma occurs in utero or right after birth, that's when the lizard brain is the most prominent. And so we may see kind of a pervasive impact on sleep, appetite, touch, or digestion. A toddler who experiences painful and repetitive sexual abuse, for example, may have no verbal memories of the event, right? Because they don't have verbal capacity yet. But we'll be able to remember certain fragments, certain sensations, sights, sounds, smells, etc. They likely will not have a chronological or a narrative memory. They'll have kind of snippets that are images or sensations. And then what happens is that we may develop kind of a widespread, pervasive anxiety, widespread repulsion to being touched, or kind of pervasive impacts with relationship and intimacy. An older child, for example, who experiences the same trauma may then develop cue-specific anxiety, and distress will come in waves depending on reminders of the event. So for example, a child who was sexually abused, let's say 7 years old, 8 years old, 9 years old, they will be able to hold some sense of that memory in a verbal way, right? They'll be able to have a story related to certain images or sounds that they remember. In a child this age, let's say they were abused at nighttime, right? They might develop an anxiety around the dark, or a fear of the dark, a fear of nighttime, right? Because that's a cue that's kind of tied to this horrible thing that happened to them. And then an adolescent with developing frontal lobes may then be able to integrate kind of feelings of guilt and shame with the trauma, with what happened. The nature of trauma, right? Very important. If it is interpersonal, which means it's perpetrated by another person, particularly your caregiver. If the terror comes from your caregiver, who's also supposed to be your source of safety, the impact is more significant. And repetitive interpersonal trauma in childhood that comes from the caregiver has the most severe and long-lasting effects, because it not only overuses the sense of terror and threat and overuses that part of the brain, but it also interferes with our attachment, right? Which is our ability to access soothing and nurturing, and an ability to develop a sense of safety and trust of the world. And then interpersonal trauma is seen much more traumatic than natural kinds of traumas or natural disasters or accidents, because it is seen as intentional rather than accidental and individual, right? It's happening to me. It didn't happen to a large group of people who happened to be in a place of an earthquake or something, right? It happened to me. And so that, the nature of that, I think, makes things very impactful as well, very devastating. And then, of course, response from caregivers and social support. What happens after you tell somebody about the trauma? What is their response? Can really impact, really moderate the significance of that as well. All right, let's go on to the next slide. What I will say here is this quote again by Dr. Perry: we tend to prefer the misery of certainty to the misery of uncertainty. What this means is that if we get used to chaos and unpredictability, that's what will feel normal to us. That's what we will expect. And that's what we will feel kind of like, okay, I know what to do with this. If we are placed in a situation, in a relationship, or a child is placed with a foster family that's calm and safe, that will feel threatening, right? Because it's different. Because something that's normal, that we're used to, we predict, we know how to do this. And so that's also important and a real important kind of piece to keep in mind. The other thing, one last thing I want to say about this is, again, our neurons that are responsible for stress and threat span the entire brain. If that response is overly activated, persistently activated, again, this becomes our default setting, right? This becomes the response that we're used to and the response that we expect. All right, let's move on to the next one. So we are constantly scanning the environment and creating templates and patterns in our brain through these neural networks. We pay attention to novel things that signify danger or opportunity, and we are able to filter out the routine, right? So we look for patterns, we make associations. These help us make predictions about the world. And then we kind of filter out the stuff that doesn't matter, right? Or the stuff that is part of the routine and deemed as safe. The part of the brain, there's a little structure called the hippocampus. It's kind of nestled right around the limbic system, right around here in the limbic system, which is responsible for memory and memory processes. That's why memory is so highly linked to emotion, right? The more emotional a memory, the more we remember it. I cannot tell you for the life of me what I had for breakfast yesterday, but I can give you a very, very detailed story about my wedding. I can tell you every minute of when my kids were born, right? These kinds of events we hold in our mind more vividly because they are more emotional. And when the emotion brain is activated, together with the thinking brain, we are able to encode these vivid, narrative, chronological memories. Because of the way the trauma works and the way our frontal lobes shut down, traumatic memory is encoded a bit differently. It is not encoded in this integrated kind of chronological sense with the beginning, middle, and end. It is largely encoded in a fragmented, visceral kind of sense because of, because of the shutdown of the frontal lobes. These certain kind of templates and patterns are then also largely encoded outside of the conscious kind of language mind. So for example, if I was constantly kind of yelled at and berated my parents for making mistakes, a template that I will have, again, outside of the conscious language mind, right? But the template I will have about the world and about myself is that I always screw up and get in trouble. So as a grown-up, what do you think will happen if I get an email from my boss asking to talk? Of course, immediately, right? My body will register a felt visceral sense of, I've screwed up and now I'm going to get it. The amygdala will recognize this as a threat and will send my body into fight or flight. All of this before I have any idea of what my boss even wants to talk about. My body is now fighting off an invisible threat. Another important piece to remember here is classical conditioning, right? Classical conditioning is also how we learn, how we make sense of the world. We pair certain things that are unrelated, but if they occur next to each other, they become related in our minds. The example of this, if any of you have heard of Pavlov's dogs, Russian scientist, behavioral scientist in the last century, in the 1920s or so, realized that if you presented dogs with a bowl of food, they would naturally start salivating. If you presented this bowl of food with a bell over and over and over and over and over again, pretty soon the dogs would salivate only to the ringing of the bell, even when there was no food. So if things occur next to each other, we learn them, right? We make these associations, we make these patterns. This example of being afraid of the dark, if that's when your trauma happened, right? You're pairing these two things. You're pairing the trauma and the fear with this cue of the dark. And the dark can become a cue for your anxiety, for your fear. If I have a car accident at a certain intersection, right? That intersection might become a cue for my fear. If I drive by that intersection, I will likely get a big reaction, right? The fight or flight response. All right, let's go to the next slide. So when we talk about trauma, and we talk about certain templates, I have to talk a little bit about attachment. You know, attachment is one of these things that, again, I can probably spend the entire day talking about, but I will do an overview of it for you to help understand in the context of this talk. So attachment is a hardwired system inside of us, again, that spans largely the emotion brain, that is designed to seek proximity to our caregiver when we are distressed. This system is crucial to our survival. We see it all the time in the animal kingdom. You know, we see these examples of zebras and baby zebras at the watering hole. They see a predator, the baby zebra goes to the mama zebra or the papa zebra. They need to do this in order to survive. We are no different. We have a system in our brain that lights up when we are distressed and seeks closeness to our caregivers. If we have caregivers that are consistently responsive and consistently available, this helps soothe our distress, and we learn trust, safety, and rest. We also learn that when we reach out for comfort, we receive it. In abusive or neglectful households, right, caregivers are also the source of threat. And in that case, our brains will be in constant stress mode, constantly emotion brain activated, with no access to soothing or comfort. And our sense of safety and trust can also be damaged in caregivers that are unresponsive or disengaged, perhaps due to substance abuse or mental health issues. So our early attachments really set the history, or really set the template for how our later relationships will work, and kind of what to expect from our relationships. All right, let's go on to the next the next slide. Let's go on to the next slide. I'm not going to spend too much time on this one, but what this one shows is just how pervasive and impactful childhood trauma can be because of all of these things that we've talked about, that we've already talked about. We will be able to, we'll have problems with emotion regulation. We might have issues with impulse control that has to do with the thinking brain, right? The strength of the thinking brain. We might have issues with attention and concentration, because if we are so busy looking out for danger signs, we're not paying attention to what we're supposed to. If we're constantly dissociating or numbing out, right, then it'll make it very hard to be an active kind of participant in everyday functioning. And then we'll see quite widespread interpersonal difficulties, again, because of these templates that we've developed about relationships and how relationships work. All right, so now we've kind of blown through, not covered, we've blown through how trauma can impact the brain, our perceptions of safety and threat. And now I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about how this might show up in grown-ups, right? How this might show up in those of us who have experienced childhood trauma or painful childhood experiences, right? How might it be expressed if we are carrying around us an implicit sense that the world is not safe, that other people are not safe, or an overactive smoke alarm that really produces kind of gut-wrenching emotions. How might this show up? Let's go on to the next slide. I tried to think about some common responses that I see in a lot of my clients who have reported a history of childhood trauma. I would really like to highlight that these are not indicators that you have experienced trauma. They're not specific, right? This doesn't mean that you have experienced trauma. These are some responses that I have seen in people who have a history or have experienced a history of painful childhood experiences. Dissociation, freezing, we've talked about how this starts out as a very protective response. However, if this response is triggered over and over and over again, it will become the go-to response to anything that is perceived as threatening. This can be internal, this can be external as well. External and internal. What this means is that our own sense of emotion, our own sense of feeling can be scary and can be distressing. And our brain can register, if we're starting to feel emotional about something, our brain will register that as a threat and will say, hey, a threat, I know just what to do with this, shut down and numb out. And a lot of my clients will talk about feeling numb all the time, right? Or if they start kind of getting an inkling of emotion, they're able just to turn it off. They're able to shut it down. And this can happen quite quickly and quite automatically. And so as you can imagine, right, this can really get in the way when we are trying to function interpersonally, or professionally, and really need to be able to have access to understanding how we're feeling and understanding how other people are feeling. Related but opposite is hypervigilance, right? So hypervigilance is another one of those learned responses that initially was protective, but now can get in the way. Hypervigilance is when we are constantly monitoring signs of danger. We're constantly monitoring signs of threat. Probably the most clear example of this is soldiers when they are out in the combat field. They have to be on alert all the time. This can be the difference between life and death. They have to monitor, they have to be able to pick out any sign of danger and react quickly. This could be the difference between dying or surviving. When they come back, however, this response is no longer adaptive, right? It's adaptive in the combat zone, but as they return to civilian world, it's hard to turn that off and can really kind of get in the way of functioning, of proper functioning. I have clients who were significantly abused as kids, physically abused and emotionally abused. And they tell me that they are always trying to predict what the other person is going to do. They are always trying to be one step ahead. They call it like a chess game. So if I say this, like I'm always looking for your reaction. I'm looking for that look or that movement that might signify danger. And the irony is that because we are so busy searching for danger signs, we actually have trouble paying attention to what is happening around us. If our smoke alarm is on all the time, how do we know when there is an actual fire? And so, all right, so that's hypervigilance. Shame. I think shame is one of those core emotions that I probably see in 9 out of 10 of my clients. You know, this sense that there is something deeply wrong with me. The sense that there's something broken inside of me for feeling the way I'm feeling. We talked about how every emotion kind of has an action tendency associated with it, right? We really focused on fear and how that's fight or flight is the response. With shame, the response is really is really to hide. You know, we want to hide. We have this feeling of just wanting to sink into the ground, just wanting to turn away and just kind of don't look at me, don't see me, don't talk to me. This, you know, often comes from a feeling of self-blame, a feeling of somehow I got what I deserved, somehow it's my fault. A lot of my clients feel a lot of shame for the freeze response, you know, for having the freeze response during their trauma and not doing anything about it, not realizing that this was their body surviving. This was the ultimate, their freeze response is the ultimate fight back. It's the ultimate will to live and survive. And yet we tend to have a lot of self-blame, a lot of shame around that response. You know, this idea of shame, this will often become a kind of a central theme in therapy, a central issue. And it's often the underlying emotion in so many of our struggles, right? It's the emotional experience of shame is so isolating. And then because of how it makes us just want to turn inward and turn away, it also really interferes with us seeking the love and support that we really need to help us get through these challenging times. Anger, right? Lots of my clients will tell me that they get angry like this. They don't know why. You know, they go from 0 to 100 in a second. And it can be anything, right? It can be any kind of perceived slight, perceived threat. It could be a change in a routine. It could be anything that just, boom, they're angry before they can think about it, right? They're feeling way before they're thinking about it. Anger is a very powerful emotion, right? It activates the entire body to attack, to approach. It tightens up our shoulders and our neck. It makes our face look scary and mean. And it's much safer sometimes to feel angry than it is to feel sad or ashamed or vulnerable. And so anger is also one of those responses that we spend a lot of time talking in therapy about. Addiction, again, not an indicator that you have experienced trauma, but a very common response in grown-ups. Addiction we can probably put as a subcategory under a lot of these, right? Under shame, under anger, under hypervigilance, where the distress of feeling, the distress of the memories, and the distress of the pain is so much that we turn to substances to numb out. And then what we recently have discovered is that there's a very strong relationship between childhood trauma and physical problems, fibromyalgia, migraines, heart disease, autoimmune disorders, etc. So a lot of my clients with significant trauma history, that's how they find me initially, is to deal with some sort of bodily issues, right? Some sort of chronic pain or chronic fatigue or something. And so I think we're realizing now more than ever that our body really kind of holds a lot of these blueprints, right? If our brain is kind of the history of our life and holds these blueprints of our life, our body holds the marks of them, right? Again, the constant stress, the constant hormones, it takes a toll on us physically. All right, let's go on to the next slide. So a few words about how this might impact certain roles that I have. I think parenting is something that I've lately been, since becoming a parent myself, something that I have thought a lot about, something that I've become really interested in, how trauma impacts parenting, how intergenerational trauma, right? How this idea that the trauma can be passed down from one generation to another. My grandmother is a Holocaust survivor. When I became a parent, I became absolutely fascinated in exploring, my own attachment history with my mom, my mom's attachment history with my grandma, and then how my grandma's trauma would have really interfered, right? Would have really impacted in that relationship between her and my mom. And then how those disruptions could have been passed on generationally. Parents with unresolved trauma, like my grandmother, have much more difficulty accurately reading and responding children's emotional needs. My parents with unresolved trauma, they're often so busy coping with their own sense of internal upset that they're not as available for their children, right? They're not as attuned to their children's emotional needs. And then what happens, right? The attachment's disrupted. A really interesting piece of research that I've come across is that, every emotion has a certain look on our face that's specific to that emotion. It helps communicate to others how we are feeling and what we need. So for parents with unresolved trauma, often the look of fear in their child looks scared. This parent can interpret this look as anger in the child. Now imagine how triggering it might be for a parent with a history of childhood trauma to see this little kid looking angrily at them, and how that would trigger a response that's completely misfiring, right? What the child is actually needing and what the child's actual emotional needs are. And it's kind of the reason why our early childhood experiences are so important. Our early attachment experiences are so important is because they really set the template for the way we parent, right? And often when we are the most tired, when we are the most frustrated, when we are the most exhausted, which is kind of a lot of the time with small children, we default to parenting the way we were parented. And so without reflection, this can often perpetuate the attachment disruptions. I do want to add in something for all you parents out there who are freaking out right now. There is no such thing as a perfect parent. Please remember that. We're not talking about the one-off, right? That you've misread your child or raised your voice. We are talking about the pattern of responses, right? We're talking about the overall pattern. Professionally, what I tend to see a lot is a fear of failure. We tend to see a lot in relationships, a fear of rejection. Always on the lookout for signs that we might be rejected or that we might be failing. And often interpreting neutral cues, right? Like a neutral kind of look or a neutral email, but we interpret that as dangerous. And our bodies can react accordingly, right? This can really get in the way of then properly responding to the situation. All right, let's go on to the next slide. I believe this is the final one, or the second to last one. I do want to end on a more kind of positive, optimistic note and talk a little bit about resilience and what impacts resilience. Resilience is our capacity to return to baseline functioning after a stressor occurs, to return to homeostasis, to steadiness, after whatever's triggered us is over, or even during, right? If we assess that it's not an actual threat. Resilience is not something we are born with. It is a skill that we can develop. It is a skill that certain things in our life and in our lifestyle can help strengthen. One of these things is routine, consistency, and predictability. If we can create a life where we can kind of predict what's coming next, it helps us feel safe, right? It helps us feel more in control. This includes a self-care routine. Self-care routine, by that, I mainly, when I talk with my clients, mainly refer to sleeping, healthy sleeping pattern, healthy diet, and regular exercise. Now, if we think back to the beginning of this talk, what did those three things, which part of the brain did they refer to? The lizard brain, right? They refer to the most primitive, basic part of our brain. If any of those things are off, then it's like when you're building a house, right? And the foundation is shaky. If you're not sleeping, if you're not eating properly, if you're not moving regularly, it is very hard then to talk about kind of higher level, emotional thinking, healing kind of stuff. So we really want to focus on a routine, habitual, consistent, and predictable routine of self-care. Reflection is the ability to think about our own thoughts, to think about our own feelings. It's the ability to say, I'm having this thought, I'm having this feeling. Research has shown that using words to label feelings, I mentioned this before, that's kind of enough to get the frontal lobes back on track. And then reflection also becomes really crucial in parenting. Being able to reflect on our own reactions, on our own actions, and then being able to kind of ask, okay, what worked and what didn't, and what part of it is my own kind of thoughts and feelings and history that's coming up. Growth mindset is the ability that growth mindset is kind of the idea of being able to look at mistakes not as failures, but as an opportunity to learn, right? So the anecdote that comes to mind, example of Thomas Edison, who invented the light bulb. And someone asked him, what is it like to fail 5,000 times? And he said, I didn't fail 5,000 times. I simply understood 5,000 times what didn't work, right? So I think that's kind of a perfect example of growth mindset. And then this idea of personal agency, right? Which is not self-blame at all. Never, ever, ever to blame for something that happened to you, right? For a trauma that happened to you, no matter what it is, it's not self-blame, right? When we talk about personal agency, we're really talking about taking responsibility for the choices we make in our life now. And this idea that we can have a sense of regulation over our own reaction and our choices. And this can be a very protective mindset. And then, of course, the quality of social support, right? The single strongest predictor of recovery across the board. When we feel like we have people that care about us, and when we feel that we can reach out and get that support that we need, is very important and protective. And then I will end with the following slide. Again, by Dr. Bruce Perry, relationships are the agents of change, and the most powerful therapy is human love. And that just encompasses the importance of relationships and connection in terms of our healing and our lives. All right. Let's do the slide after. I think that's the BCAPA slide again. Those are my references. Let's go forward. Okay, let's do questions. Let's do some questions. So Peter, what's the best way for me to click on chat?
Yeah, you can click on chat, or I can read them directly to you. We do have a few already.
Okay, let me take a look. Let me see if I can start from the beginning. Okay, oh, there's a few comments about how good it is. That's nice, thank you. Oh, here's a question. So it's kind of like someone playing with a light switch that you mentioned earlier. Our fight or flight system is exactly like a light switch. Hold on, I'm gonna scooch over and show you what I mean. So We are designed to be at rest with the light switch turned off until it's turned on by a threat. Then we are in threat mode until our system assesses that the threat is over and turns off the light. Interesting tidbit is that the inhale turns on the light, the exhale turns off the light. So if we are feeling particularly panicky or particularly anxious, we really want to focus on slowing down the exhale, really focusing and slowing down the exhale. And that's going to help turn off the light switch and turn on the rest and restore system. All right. The next question is, what if you had a lot of traumas that are not common ones and were not aware of them being traumas until your 30s and now have chronic pain? And only now are learning how trauma can impact chronic pain? That's a great question. That is often how I see my clients. The question is, how do you heal from that? And the answer is, I would say to seek out a therapist that you feel comfortable with, that you have a connection with. And hopefully through doing some reflection work and starting to understand the relationship between how our minds feel and how our bodies feel, we can start kind of making those connections, and we can start tolerating certain thoughts and feelings and sensations. I hope that answers the question. There's also some new kind of really out of the box research on the importance of movement and healing kinds of rhythmic kinds of breathing movements that can also help soothe the emotion brain, and just help kind of bring it to rest. So rhythmic activities that involve breath, yoga, or even just kind of hitting a ball against the wall. And breath work. A lot of what I do in my sessions is a lot of breath work, a lot of kind of mindful body awareness work. Are there any connections between childhood trauma and choice of career that you're aware of? Wow, what an interesting question. I don't actually know a lot of research about that. I know lots of psychologists and counselors tend to have had some pretty painful childhood experiences. So maybe there's something there in choosing that path, but I'm not aware of specific research about that. Let's see, I am thinking that a child growing up in an abusive environment could easily learn that the only time their parents are not critical of them is when they are sick. And these children, could this response be their way of getting the love and attention they need? I mean, certainly, right? If children learn that the only time they're getting warmth and comfort from their parents is when they're sick, they can certainly learn that connection, that if I'm not feeling well, I'll get that sense of connection that I need and that I want. That's a really interesting one too. Trying to think what experience I have with that. I have had clients tell me something to this effect, right? That when they were not feeling well, that's when their parents were most responsive. And so they loved kind of staying home from school and being sick. Absolutely. What do you think about the pervasiveness of trauma and how the term is thrown around on social media? What are your thoughts on the belief that everyone has trauma? I think that refers to something I was talking about right in the beginning of the presentation, which is, that there is a difference between stress and trauma. And I think we go back to the definition of trauma, which is, actual or threatened injury to your body, actually experiencing it, witnessing it, or learning that it's occurred to somebody. I try like a lot of things. A lot of people will talk about things like, like a traumatic divorce or a traumatic kind of, I don't know what another example, like a traumatic kind of stressor. I tend to try to stay away from calling even really big stressors, but if they don't involve this kind of the definition of trauma, right? If they don't kind of involve a threat, bodily threat or bodily injury, again, either experiencing it or witnessing it or learning about it, I try to explain that certain stressors are really big, right? And will have kind of similar effects in our bodies that a trauma will. Um, let's see. How do you start to move forward from the trauma and build safe relationships? Wow, that's a $1 million question, right? It's a really big question. Again, I would start by finding a therapist that understands trauma, that is able to work from a trauma-informed perspective, and um, to start kind of to start exploring, the templates that you have learned, the stories that have been ingrained in you, right? The patterns that have been ingrained. Um, and maybe starting to explore what a safe relationship will look like, right? Because again, the trauma interferes with our sense of safety and our sense of what's expectable, what's to expect. And so starting to kind of understand what is a safe relationship, how does that feel in my body? And even though that's different, that doesn't mean it's bad, right? And to start kind of getting used to that idea and tolerating some of those conflicts that will be inside of you as you start trying something different with safe relationships. Again, great question. And then, do all therapists understand trauma and chronic pain connections? I wish. I think a lot more therapists are starting to understand a lot more about these connections. So I don't know if I would say all though, but a lot of them do. All right. You know what? We have a few more things. Oh yeah, a difference between trauma and adverse childhood experiences. I think adverse childhood experiences encompasses a lot of what we've talked about. And why to use trauma and not ACEs. I think that's just the term that I am, familiar with. And a lot of the adverse childhood experiences are certainly under that kind of larger umbrella when we talk about children, right? So like growing up in poverty, we know now that is considered a traumatic kind of stressor, systemic kinds of racism and things like this. And adverse childhood experiences, right? Growing up with a parent with mental health issues or substance abuse issues. So I think what the adverse childhood experiences research has done is it helped us broaden our idea of understanding trauma in childhood. And then any questions? I see a couple of questions about specific kind of resources or referrals for therapists. Probably the best thing to do for that, for kind of specifics, is to contact BCPA for any kinds of referrals or information. Can you talk more about habits and routine? Is that helpful in creating a safe zone? Absolutely yes. Absolutely yes. Habits and routine are essential for creating a safe zone. The reason why is it makes the world much more predictable for us. Nowhere do we see this more than in daycare settings, right? Those of you who have small children in daycare, you see that their days there are structured, to the minute. Outside time, 9:30 to 10, circle time, 10 to 10:30, snack, 10:30, right? Reading time. And it's consistent. Day to day, it's consistent. So their outside play, they can do whatever they want. It varies, but the kids know that at this time in the morning, they're outside. Obviously, kids that young, they cannot tell time. But what that kind of structure does is it helps their days feel like they can predict what's going to happen next, right? So if I'm doing outside play, I can kind of predict that after that we'll have circle time. Um, and being able to have that sense of control when we think about it, right? The world is just so chaotic, and there's so much going on all the time that that kind of sense of control is really important. Um, all right. Any more kinds of specific questions about anything that I've talked to? Peter, is there a way to get my email out to the group? I think that might be more helpful. Peter?
Yeah, sorry, I just had to unmute. Yeah, if you want to link your email and chat, that's fine. Whichever one you prefer, because I have a few on the for you, so I don't want to give out the wrong one.
Okay, sounds good. Um, and then probably if we can we go to the BCPA slide? For those of you looking for kinds of more specific resources or more specific information, then certainly please look at the BCPA website and look through all the talks. There are some really wonderful, interesting talks that are going on. So please take a look at those. And I believe that is it for me.